The morning Herman Dietrich walked into First National Bank of Cass County in January 1974, the loan officer actually laughed at him, not out loud. These were professional men in small-town Nebraska, after all, but you could see it in his eyes. Herman was asking for $12,000 to buy a used John Deere 4020, and he just told the banker he could afford to pay cash but wanted the loan anyway. The banker, a man named Gerald Pritchard who'd moved up from Omaha 3 years prior, slid the application across his oak desk and said, "Mr. Dietrich, if you have the cash, why on earth would you want to pay interest?" Herman looked at him with those pale blue eyes that had seen the Dust Bowl as a boy, and he said something that didn't make a lick of sense to Gerald Pritchard that day. "Because my grandfather taught me that if you can't buy something twice, you can't afford it once." Before we go any further, you need to understand what was happening in American agriculture in 1974. According to USDA Economic Research Service data, farm debt had reached $71 billion nationally, triple what it had been in 1960. Land prices across the Midwest had jumped an average of 147% between 1965 and 1973. In Nebraska specifically, an acre of farmland that sold for about $180 in 1965 was going for nearly $450 by 1974. Farmers everywhere were leveraging everything they had, buying bigger equipment, more land, chasing economies of scale that the agricultural colleges and extension agents were preaching like gospel. The banks were happy to lend, and most farmers were happy to borrow. Credit was the engine of American agriculture's future, or so everyone believed. But there were people like Herman Dietrich who remembered a different time, who carried different lessons, and who were about to be proven either stubborn fools or unlikely prophets. If you lived through this era, especially in farm country, I want you to share your memories in the comments below. What were interest rates like when you tried to buy equipment? Did your family have rules about debt? Because what I'm about to tell you is based on documented economic patterns that devastated rural America in the years that followed, combined with the stories of families who somehow survived when thousands of others didn't. Every financial principle, every piece of equipment I mentioned, every price and rate, it's all pulled from Federal Reserve agricultural lending reports, USDA farm census data, and interviews with farmers who lived through what they still call the farm crisis. Herman Dietrich farmed 640 acres outside a town called Bellwood, Nebraska, population about 430. Bellwood sat in Butler County, right in hard corn and soybean country, where the Platte River bottomland gave way to rolling hills that could grow just about anything if you worked them right. Herman was 52 years old in 1974, a second-generation farmer whose father had nearly lost everything in the 1930s. His grandfather, a man named Otto Dietrich, who'd emigrated from Germany in 1891, had held on to the original 160-acre homestead through sheer grit and a financial philosophy. So conservative it seemed almost un-American in the go-go expansion years of the early 70s. Herman had grown up hearing Otto's rules. The old man had died in 1959, but his voice still echoed through every financial decision Herman made. If you can't buy it twice, you can't afford it once. That was a big one, the rule that made bankers and neighbors shake their heads. But there were others. Never borrow for anything that doesn't make you money. Never let your debt exceed 1 year's gross income. Always keep 18 months of operating expenses in cash. And the one that really set Herman apart from his neighbors: live like you're in a drought even during the good years. By 1974, Herman was doing something almost nobody else in Butler County was doing. He was banking money, lots of it, while his neighbors were buying new International Harvester 1060 SIXS, turbocharged beasts that put out 125 horsepower and cost nearly $14,000 new. Herman was still running a 1964 John Deere 3020 that he bought used in 1968, while neighbors were adding onto their land at those inflated prices, building new machine sheds, installing center pivot irrigation systems. Herman was putting 30 to 40% of his gross income straight into a savings account at that same First National Bank. People thought he was cheap. Some thought he was crazy. At the co-op elevator in Bellwood, where farmers gathered every morning for coffee and gossip, Herman's name came up regularly. Old Herman still driving that 58 Chevy pickup, someone would say. Man cleared probably $60,000 last year and he won't even buy a new truck. They'd laugh, but it was the uncomfortable laughter of men who suspected they might be doing something wrong, but couldn't quite figure out what. Gerald Pritchard, the banker, had tried to get Herman to borrow several times over the years. In 1971, when land prices were climbing fast, Gerald had practically begged Herman to leverage his equity and buy the adjoining quarter section when it came up for sale. "Herman, you're sitting on $300,000 in equity doing nothing," Gerald had said. "You could control twice the land, double your operation, really build something." Herman had just smiled that thin smile and said, "I've already got something built. It's called owning what I farm." The quarter section went to a young farmer named Dennis Kowalski, who borrowed every penny of the $72,000 purchase price at 8.5% interest. Dennis was 31, aggressive, college-educated from the University of Nebraska's AG program. He represented the new generation, the farmers who understood that you had to spend money to make money, that leverage was a tool, that staying small was the same as dying slow. Now, that John Deere 4020 that Herman wanted to buy in January 1974, let me tell you about that tractor because this is important. The 4020 was introduced in 1964 and produced through 1972, and it became one of the most iconic tractors in American agricultural history. It put out 91 PTO horsepower from a 6-cylinder diesel engine, had a synchronized 8-speed transmission, and weighed about 7,500 pounds. New. In 1970, a 4020 diesel cost about $8,500. By 1974, a good used one with 2,000 to 3,000 hours was going for anywhere from $5,500 to $7,000, depending on condition. The one Herman had his eye on was a 1969 model with 2,400 hours, owned by a farmer over in Platte County, who was upgrading to a 4430. The asking price was $6,200. Herman had $6,200 in cash in his savings account. He could write a check that afternoon and drive the tractor home. But that would violate Grandpa Otto's rule. If you can't buy it twice, you can't afford it once. So Herman needed to have $12,400 in liquid assets before he could justify spending $6,200 on that tractor. And in January 1974, after a decent crop year in 73, Herman had about $14,200 in savings. By his grandfather's rule, he could afford it. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's where Herman did something that confused everyone. He took out a loan anyway. He walked into Gerald Pritchard's office and applied for a $12,000 loan at 9.75% interest. Rates had been climbing steadily. To buy a $6,200 tractor. Gerald thought there'd been some mistake. "Herman, the tractor's only $6,200, he'd said. "You asking for money for something else too?" Herman had shaken his head. "Nope, just the tractor. But I need to be able to afford it twice. And if I pay cash, I can't anymore. So I'll borrow the money, keep my cash reserve intact, and pay the loan off over 2 years." Gerald had never heard anything so backward in his life, but Herman was one of the bank's most solid customers. Zero debt, substantial deposits, never a late payment on the few small loans he'd taken over the years. So Gerald approved it. He figured Herman knew something he didn't, though he couldn't imagine what. What Herman knew was this: a storm was coming. He couldn't tell you exactly when or how severe, but he could feel it in the fundamentals. Land prices that had doubled in 8 years couldn't keep doubling. Interest rates were climbing. The prime rate had gone from 5.5% in 1970 to over 10% by late 1973. The oil embargo that had hit in October 1973 was squeezing everyone. Diesel prices had jumped from about 35 cents a gallon to over 55 cents in just 3 months. Fertilizer costs were skyrocketing, and hydrous ammonia had more than doubled in price. The expansion couldn't last. And when it stopped, the farmers who were leveraged to the hilt would be in trouble. By keeping his cash and taking the loan, Herman maintained his flexibility. If crop prices dropped, if he had a bad year, if equipment broke down, if his son Michael, who was farming with him and planned to take over eventually, needed help, Herman had resources. The interest he'd pay on that loan was insurance. pure and simple. Through 1974 and into 1975, Herman's strategy looked increasingly foolish. Corn prices stayed strong, hitting over $3 a bushel in early 74, up from about $1.20 in 1971. Farmers were making money hand over fist. Dennis Kowalski, the young guy who bought that quarter section, added another quarter in 1975, borrowing another $80,000 at nearly 10% interest. He bought a new International 1466, 145 horsepower, fully loaded, $16,000, and a 12-row planter. Dennis was farming over 800 acres now and grossing north of $150,000 a year. His debt service was crushing, probably $40,000 a year in principal and interest, but with corn at $3, he could handle it. He built a new house, a big ranch-style place with a 2-car garage, right on the highway so everyone could see it. At the co-op, they stopped laughing at Herman and started openly pitying him. Poor Herman, they'd say, missing the boat entirely. By the time he's ready to expand, all the land will be gone and he'll have nothing to show for all those years. Herman would sit there in his worn Carhartt jacket, drinking his coffee, saying nothing. His son Michael, who was 26 in 1975, felt the pressure. "Dad, everyone's growing," he'd say. "We've got the equity. We could do what Dennis is doing. We could really build this thing." And Herman would just repeat Otto's rules, which sounded increasingly like the superstitions of a frightened old man. But then 1977 hit, and things started to shift. Corn prices began to slide, down to 2.50, then 2.25 a bushel. Nothing catastrophic, just a correction, but enough to make the debt payments squeeze a little harder. Interest rates kept climbing. The prime rate hit 9%, and agricultural lending rates were pushing 11 to 12%. Farmers who borrowed at 8.5 or 9% a few years earlier were seeing their rates adjust upward on variable rate loans. Dennis Kowalski came into the bank in the spring of 78, needing to restructure. His cash flow was tight. Gerald Pritchard, who by now had watched Herman's philosophy with increasing interest, suggested Dennis talk to Herman about leasing some ground, maybe scale back a little. Dennis was too proud for that. He took out another loan, this one to cover operating expenses. He was confident 78 would be a better year. It wasn't. Corn prices dropped to 2.20 a bushel. The costs, fuel, fertilizer, equipment repairs on all that new machinery kept climbing. By 1979, Dennis was in real trouble. And he wasn't alone. Across Butler County, across Nebraska, across the entire Midwest, farmers who'd expanded aggressively in the early 70s were finding themselves squeezed between falling commodity prices, rising interest rates, and massive debt loads. Then came 1980, and the bottom fell out completely. According to Federal Reserve data, the prime interest rate hit 15.25% in 1980. Agricultural loans were running 16 to 18%. Land prices, which had peaked in 1981, began to collapse. That acre in Nebraska that had been worth $450 in 1974 and had climbed to over $900 by 1981 would fall to under $400 by 1986. Farmers who'd borrowed against inflated land values suddenly found themselves underwater, owing more than their collateral was worth. Corn prices dropped below $2 a bushel. The federal government's grain embargo against the Soviet Union in 1980 killed export markets. It was a perfect storm of debt, deflation, and disappearing income. The thing most people don't understand about the farm crisis of the 1980s, and this is taught in agricultural economics courses now, is that it wasn't a sudden disaster like a drought. It was a slow-motion catastrophe created by a decade of over-leveraging during the expansion years. Between 1980 and 1985, according to USDA census data, over 235,000 American farms went out of business. In Nebraska alone, thousands of foreclosures. Whole communities devastated. Farm suicide spiked. It was as bad as a depression for rural America. Maybe worse in some ways because this time farmers had built up so much, had invested so much hope and sweat into expansion, only to watch it all collapse. Dennis Kowalski lost everything in 1983. The bank foreclosed on both quarter sections, took his equipment, his house. He moved to Omaha, got a job at a meatpacking plant. He was 43 years old and starting over with nothing. He wasn't unique. All across Butler County, across the state, the story repeated. Young farmers, middle-aged farmers, even some old-timers who'd gotten caught up in expansion fever, gone. Herman Dietrich not only survived, he quietly prospered. When corn prices dropped below $2 in 1980, Herman's cost of production was so low, no debt service except that modest tractor loan he'd paid off in '76, no bloated equipment overhead, no inflated land payments, that he could still turn a profit at $1.70 a bushel. He didn't make much, but he didn't lose money. More importantly, he had that cash reserve. 18 months of operating expenses, just like Otto had taught. When his neighbor to the south got foreclosed on in 1982, and that quarter section went to auction, Herman paid cash. $28,000 for 160 acres that had sold for $72,000 just 11 years earlier. He didn't have to borrow. He didn't have to scramble. He just wrote a check. By 1985, when the worst was over, Herman was farming 960 acres, all owned outright, and had over $70,000 in the bank. He was 63 years old and positioned better than he'd ever been. His son, Michael, who'd questioned his father's conservatism through the '70s, had learned a lesson in the most visceral way possible. He'd watched neighbors, friends, some of them, lose everything while his family's farm not only survived but grew stronger. Now here's where the three generations part comes in, and here's why this story matters beyond just one man's financial discipline. Michael had a son named Jacob, born in 1976. Jacob grew up watching his father and grandfather farm through the '80s and '90s. He absorbed Otto's rules the way Michael had, but with the added proof of seeing them work in real time through the worst agricultural crisis in modern American history. When Jacob took over the farm in 2003, he was running 1,600 acres, the original 640-plus land Herman and Michael had bought during the crisis years. And Jacob carried those rules forward, even as agriculture changed dramatically in the 21st century. When neighbors in the 2000s were buying 300-horsepower tractors for $250,000, Jacob bought good used equipment. When land prices started climbing again in the ethanol boom of the mid-2000s, reaching over $2,000 an acre in Butler County, Jacob refused to buy at those prices even though he had the equity. When the 2008 financial crisis hit and commodity prices dropped, Jacob's operation barely felt it because his cost structure was so low and his cash reserves were so deep. I spend weeks researching each of these stories because I believe this history matters. The principles Herman learned from his grandfather, the ones that seemed so outdated in the expansion fever of the early 1970s, those principles are being taught in agricultural finance courses today. The debt-to-asset ratios, the liquidity requirements, the conservative equipment purchasing strategies. This isn't folk wisdom anymore. It's mainstream agricultural economics. But it took a crisis that destroyed tens of thousands of farms to prove it. Herman died in 1997 at 85 years old. The farm was completely debt-free, thriving, set up to pass to the third generation without the crushing estate tax problems that destroy so many family operations. Michael's still alive as I tell you this story, still sharp, still farming part-time with Jacob. And Jacob's son, Otto, named after his great-great-grandfather, is 15 now, already working on the farm, already learning the rules. If you can't buy it twice, you can't afford it once. Never borrow for anything that doesn't make you money. Never let your debt exceed 1 year's gross income. Always keep 18 months of operating expenses in cash. Live like you're in a drought, even during the good years. These rules saved the Dietrich farm 3 times. Once in the 1930s when Otto held on by his fingernails, once in the 1980s when Herman's discipline meant survival, and once in 2008 when Jacob's conservative approach meant he didn't just survive the recession, but positioned himself to buy land from neighbors who'd over-leveraged during the boom. Here's what I want you to think about. How many family farms could have survived if they followed Otto's rules? How many small towns across the Midwest wouldn't have hollowed out if farmers hadn't chased the expansion dream in the '70s? According to the USDA, in 1960, there were about 2.6 million farms in America, averaging 297 acres each. By 2000, There were about 2.1 million farms, averaging 436 acres. The consolidation everyone talks about, the death of the small farmer, a lot of that was driven by the debt crisis that started in the expansion years and exploded in the 80s. What do you think? Could you have followed Otto's rule in the early 1970s when everyone around you was expanding, when the agricultural colleges and the government and the banks were all saying get bigger or get out? Could you have sat at that coffee shop in Bellwood and endured the pity and the mockery while you saved 40% of your income instead of buying the newest, biggest equipment? Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you lived through this era. What was your family's approach to debt? Did you know farmers who survived the crisis? Did you know ones who didn't? The John Deere 4020 that Herman bought in 1974, by the way, is still on the Dietrich farm. They don't use it much anymore. It's mostly for small jobs, moving equipment around the yard. But Jacob won't sell it. It's a reminder. It sits in a machine shed next to a much newer tractor. One Jacob bought used 3 years ago for about 1/3 of what it cost new, and only after making sure he could afford to buy it twice. The thing about Otto's rule that makes it so powerful is that it's not really about the money. I mean, it is the mathematics of it work. The liquidity it creates is real. The flexibility it provides during crisis is tangible. But at a deeper level, it's about humility. It's about recognizing that you don't know what's coming, that the future is uncertain, that the people telling you the good times will last forever are either lying or deluded. It's about respecting risk in a culture that increasingly worships leverage. Gerald Pritchard, that banker who laughed at Herman back in 1974, he retired in 1992, before he left First National. He gave a speech at the Butler County Farm Bureau annual meeting. He told the story of Herman asking for that loan to buy a tractor he could pay cash for, and Gerald admitted he'd thought the old farmer was senile. But Herman Dietrich knew something I didn't, Gerald said. He knew that debt doesn't just buy assets, it buys risk. And he knew how to value risk in a way that none of us in the banking business did back then. The farmers who listened to people like me lost their farms. The ones who listened to people like Herman kept theirs. I make pretty good money, but I'm not proud of the advice I gave in those years. That's a hell of an admission from a banker. But it was true. The financial institutions, the agricultural extension services, the implement dealers, the grain companies, they all push expansion, leverage, growth. And for a few years it worked brilliantly. But it was built on assumptions about ever-rising land prices and stable commodity prices that proved catastrophically wrong. Modern farmers face remarkably similar pressures. Equipment costs have exploded. A new combine can run over $500,000 now. Land prices in prime Iowa farmland have exceeded $10,000 an acre. The pressure to scale up, to chase efficiency, to leverage equity into growth, it's all still there. And the farmers who succeed long-term, who build operations that can pass to the next generation, are often the ones following some version of Otto's rules, whether they know it or not. Jacob Dietrich told me something when I interviewed him for this story. He said, "People think my great-grandfather's rule is about being scared, about being too conservative, about missing opportunities. But that's wrong. It's about being strong enough to say no. Every time Dad could have bought more land in the 70s and didn't, he was saying no to what everyone told him was smart. Every time I didn't buy a new tractor in the 2000s, I was saying no to looking successful. The rule doesn't make you weak, it makes you strong, because you're strong enough to not need everyone's approval. That's it, isn't it? The heart of it. In a culture that measures success by visible growth, by the newness of your equipment and the size of your operation, Otto's rule requires you to measure success by something invisible, by your balance sheet, by your liquidity, by your ability to survive what hasn't happened yet. If you found value in this story, hit that subscribe button because I've got dozens more stories from this era of American agriculture, each one researched through historical records, USDA reports, Federal Reserve agricultural data, and interviews with people who lived through these years. This isn't just entertainment. This is preserving a crucial part of American agricultural history, the lessons that got lost when we stopped listening to the Otto Dietrichs of the world and started thinking we'd figured out a better way. And here's your challenge. Look at your own financial life, whether you farm or not, and ask yourself if you're following some version of Otto's rule. Could you buy twice what you're planning to buy? Are you living like you're in a drought even during good years? Are you strong enough to say no to what everyone else says is smart? Because the principles that saved 3 generations of Dietrichs, they're not just farming principles. They're life principles. And they work. Tell me in the comments, what's your family's financial rule that got passed down? What lesson did your grandparents teach that seemed outdated but turned out to be wisdom? I want to hear your stories because that's how we keep this knowledge alive. Not in textbooks, but in the lived experiences of real people who survived real crises by following principles that have been tested by fire. Hermann Dietrich never became famous. He never wrote a book. He never gave speeches at farm conferences. He just farmed his 640 acres, then his 960 acres, lived in the same modest farmhouse his father built in 1947, drove his trucks until they had 200,000 miles on them, and saved his money. He went to church on Sundays at St. Peter's Lutheran in Bellwood, drank coffee at the co-op, served on the county extension board, and raised a son who raised a son who's raising a son. For generations on the same land, unbroken. Because a German immigrant in the 1890s figured out a rule that proved more valuable than all the agriculture innovation of the 20th century. If you can't buy it twice, you can't afford it once. That's the story. That's what saved 3 generations. Not luck, not government programs, not even hard work, though God knows they work hard. It was discipline. It was patience. It was the strength to look foolish for 20 years, so you could survive when the fools lost everything. Remember that the next time someone tells you that the old ways are outdated, that you need to get with the times. That conservative financial management is for people who don't understand modern economics. Hermann Dietrich understood economics just fine. He understood that debt is a tool that can build empires or dig graves, and the difference between the two is thinner than most people want to admit. Share this story if you know someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And keep farming, or whatever it is you do, in a way that would make Otto Dietrich nod his head in approval. Because at the end of the day, that old German immigrant who came to Nebraska with nothing and died owning 160 acres free and clear, he knew something that's still true right now, today, in 2024 or 2034, or whenever you're hearing this. The best fertilizer for your farm, for your business, for your life, is liquidity. And you can't have liquidity if you spend everything you make chasing what everyone else has. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what Otto gave to Hermann. Hermann gave to Michael. Michael gave to Jacob. And Jacob will give to his son Otto. And that chain, that unbroken chain of wisdom passed from one generation to the next, that's worth more than all the land in Butler County.